It begins quietly, the kind of quiet that feels like a warning, the kind that makes the soul tense before the mind understands why. There is no explosion, no dramatic betrayal, no shouted argument echoing through a hallway. Instead, it comes like a cold draft across the heart. The moment an empath senses that someone they once poured their entire being into now treats them as optional. This shift is so subtle that most people would miss it, but empaths feel it like a fracture under the skin. And the tragedy is that they saw it coming long before they admitted it. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For empaths, this unconscious force is not weakness, it is programming. A quiet, inherited belief that their worth is measured by how much they can soothe, rescue, or fix for others. This belief becomes their persona, the mask they wear that says, "I'm fine, let me help you." And as long as they keep that mask on, the world applauds them. But deep in their shadow, a different story grows. The terror that if they stop being useful, they will no longer be loved. You see this pattern clearly in people like Adrian, a man everyone at his workplace described as the heart of the team. He remembered birthdays, he proofread others' presentations, he stayed late to comfort stressed colleagues. Yet no one ever asked him how he was. One evening, after carrying a teammate's workload for weeks, Adrian finally told his manager he was exhausted. The response was cold. "Well, figure it out. We all have problems." That night, Adrian felt something inside him split because he realized they never valued him. They valued the emotional labor he offered without question. This is Jung's concept of projection at work. People projected onto Adrian the role they wanted him to play, not because they cared for him, but because his persona made it easy for them to do so. And Adrian, like most empaths, let it happen without noticing the cost. The dramatic irony here is painful. The more he helped them, the less they saw him. And then comes the collapse, the moment the empath watches someone they rescued finally heal, only to drift away or, worse, replace them. The empath feels discarded, but the truth is darker. The relationship was never built on mutual recognition, it was built on function. They were the emotional crutch, and no one keeps a crutch once they learn to walk again. This realization shatters the identity the empath works so hard to maintain. Because if you've built your self-worth around being needed, what happens when the need disappears? That question becomes the doorway to everything that follows. That's when the abandonment begins and the empath realizes the mask they wore was never love. It was function. It always starts with a tiny crack, the moment the good guy finally slips, and the world shows him who they actually saw all along. Darren had built his whole identity around being reliable, warm, endlessly supportive. In the office hallway, people greeted him with relief, not affection, as if he were a walking emotional toolkit. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we designed to survive the expectations of others, and Darren's persona was flawless. He was the approachable one, the steady one, the one who never said no. But behind his soft smile was a truth he never admitted, even to himself. He was terrified of what would happen if he stopped performing. That fear became part of his unconscious, shaping every yes he gave. Jung warned, the persona is what one is in reality not, but what oneself and others think one is. And Darren had been living inside a mask so long that even he confused it for his real face. The collapse began quietly. On a Friday afternoon, while juggling tasks he didn't have the courage to decline, Darren missed a deadline. Not by much, maybe an hour, but the reaction was instant. His manager didn't ask if he was struggling. His teammate didn't even look up before snapping, "You're slipping." The irony was cruel. The same people who had leaned on him for years were now the first to withdraw their warmth. This is what Jung called Projection. They had projected their emotional burdens onto him, assuming he could carry them endlessly. The moment he showed a crack, their projection shattered, and they recoiled, confused and irritated, as if Darren had violated an unspoken contract. That night, Darren sat in the dim glow of his apartment, replaying the moment over and over. He wondered how admiration could turn to disappointment so fast. But here's the mystery most people never see. They were never admiring Darren. They were admiring the comfort he gave them. He had become an archetype, the caregiver, the emotional medic. And archetypes are not loved. They are used. A colleague once confided in him about a failed marriage, crying into his coffee in the break room. Another time, a senior manager whispered secrets about his panic attacks. But no one ever asked Darren how he felt, what he feared, what kept him awake at night. The dramatic irony was brutal. He had listened to everyone's pain, yet no one even noticed his. As he stared at the blank wall across from his couch, he realized something that felt like a punch to the chest. They never knew him, not the real him. They knew the persona he had crafted to avoid loneliness, to earn acceptance, to be the reliable one. And when he failed to uphold that mask for a single moment, the whole illusion fell apart. Jung believed that this is the moment the shadow begins to stir, the hidden self that whispers, "This isn't who you are." Darren felt it that night, a quiet rebellion forming inside him, a small voice saying he deserved more than transactional admiration, but he wasn't ready to face it yet. That would come later. For now, he sat in silence, stunned, heartbroken, and awakening in slow motion. Not because people betrayed him, but because they revealed what he had never dared question about himself. They were only drawn to what he gave, not who he was. It always begins quietly, almost invisibly, not with an argument, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a soft internal whisper that something inside you is slipping out of balance. Being the one who understands everyone sounds noble, almost heroic, but there is a hidden danger in it that most people never see. Because when you become the person who absorbs every emotion in the room, something strange starts happening. You become the one no one tries to understand. It isn't intentional. It isn't cruel. It's simply human nature. People get used to emotional comfort the way they get used to warm light. They stop noticing where it comes from. And this is where Carl Jung's warning comes alive. What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. The empath resists their own pain, suppresses their own needs, pushes their feelings deep underground, and those buried feelings settle into the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the place where we hide the parts of ourselves we don't want to face, the anger we swallow, the boundaries we ignore, the quiet resentment we pretend isn't there. Over time, the shadow grows heavy, and the empath, trying so hard to maintain peace, becomes a divided self. On the surface, they seem calm, patient, endlessly available. But inside, something tightens a little more each day. That tension shows up in small moments, a forced smile, a delayed reply, the silent wish that someone just once would ask, "And how are you?" But no one does. They assume the empath is fine because the empath has spent years performing fine as their persona. There was a man named Malcolm, a school counselor who everyone described as the safest person alive. Students trusted him, teachers leaned on him, even the principal came to him during stressful weeks. Malcolm carried all of it with grace, or at least that's how it looked. What no one knew was that for years, Malcolm felt every story too deeply. Every heartbreak, every crisis, every confession, but he never showed it. His persona, the calm healer, didn't allow cracks. One Wednesday morning, he sat in his car before work, gripping the steering wheel, unable to breathe. Not because of panic, not because of anger, but because something inside him whispered, "I can't do this anymore." And in that moment, Malcolm's shadow, The part of him he ignored for too long finally spoke. He didn't show up for work that day, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel guilty. His co-workers were confused. Some called him dramatic. Others wondered if he was quitting. The irony. He wasn't breaking down. He was waking up. Jung believed that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Malcolm hadn't accepted himself in a long time. He accepted everyone else, their needs, their fears, their storms, but not his own. So when he disappeared for a day, people noticed the absence, not his suffering, because they had only ever seen the role he played, not the man inside it. The empath's breaking point rarely looks like chaos. It looks like silence, withdrawal, distance, a soft closing of the door, and the tragedy is that the world often misreads this as coldness, as if the empath suddenly stopped caring. But the truth is far more haunting. They cared too much for too long, and there was nothing left to give. This is the moment when the shadow rebels, not with rage, but with exhaustion. And one day you wake up realizing you were never included in the safety you gave. It always strikes faster than you expect. That cold, sinking moment when you realize the person who once needed you desperately has already found someone else to lean on. It feels like watching a door close in slow motion, even though you are still standing inside the room. Most people think the empath's pain comes from abandonment, but the real wound begins earlier, in the instant they see how effortlessly they can be replaced. That's when something inside them breaks, because it forces them to confront a truth they've avoided for years. Carl Jung warned us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And empaths often avoid seeing that the bond they believed in was not a bond at all. It was a transaction wrapped in emotion. Jung would call this a collapse of projection. The empath assumes their emotional service creates intimacy, but for many people, the empathy was merely a resource, a temporary shelter during a personal storm. When the sky's clear, the shelter is no longer needed. And the empath, who thought offering safety meant earning connection, is left staring at an empty doorway, wondering what they missed. I once knew a man named Lucas who spent years supporting a friend, Ryan, through breakups, family drama, financial stress, everything. Ryan would call him at midnight, crying, venting, begging for advice. Lucas always answered. Always helped, always cared. But one day, when Lucas needed a small favor, help moving a couch, Ryan didn't respond for 2 days. And when he finally called back, he casually mentioned he'd been busy hanging out with a new group of people. "Sorry, man, didn't see your text." But Lucas recognized the truth instantly. Ryan had found new emotional anchors, new listeners, new rescuers. Lucas wasn't needed anymore, and therefore he wasn't included anymore. This is the dramatic irony Jung spoke of, that people will cling to an archetype, not a person. To Ryan, Lucas had been the caregiver archetype, not a friend, and archetypes are interchangeable, replaceable, disposable. The moment someone else fills the role, the former one fades like a background character leaving the frame. Jung's idea of the persona also lives here. The empath assumes their giving nature creates closeness, but the persona, the helpful mask, is what people often attach to. It is not the empath's heart they bond with. It is the emotional relief they receive. And once their crisis ends, the empath becomes like a life jacket after a shipwreck, essential in danger, unnecessary on land, useful in chaos, invisible in calm. And when the empath asks, quietly, was any of it real? The universe answers with something harsher than cruelty. Indifference, not anger, not hatred, just absence. A void where connection should have been. Because healing someone's wounds does not guarantee a place in their future. A life jacket is held tightly during the storm, but left behind once the shore is reached. This is the awakening point Jung hinted at when he wrote, Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. The empath's heartbreak is not proof that others were cruel. It is proof that the empath believed their value was measured by how much emotional weight they could carry for others. But storms end, people recover, and the empath, who poured their soul into being indispensable, watches someone else take their place with stunning ease. Yet this moment, as devastating as it feels, becomes the first crack of light in a long-hidden doorway. Because only when the illusion of connection collapses can the empath finally question the belief that held them hostage, the belief that their presence only had value when it was fixing something, and that is where the awakening begins. Because the real wound was never them leaving, it was you believing that your presence only had value when it was fixing something. It always begins with a moment that feels almost too small to matter. A pause, a hesitation, a quiet internal whisper asking, "What about me?" Most empaths ignore it, brushing it aside like dust. But this whisper is not weakness. It's the beginning of an inner revolt, because every empath eventually reaches a point where their soul refuses to stay silent any longer. And that moment, as subtle as it seems, marks the first encounter with the shadow, the part of themselves they've spent a lifetime outrunning. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are means confronting the parts you've abandoned to survive. The truth is harsh. Your kindness was never the problem. Your silence was." Empaths are taught early that goodness means swallowing discomfort, hiding needs, and carrying emotional loads that were never theirs to hold. And so they learn to fuse love with sacrifice, comfort with compliance, belonging with invisibility. They believe that saying no is selfish, that setting boundaries creates distance, and that being emotionally exhausted is just part of being a caring person. But those beliefs are not love, they are conditioning. To individuate, in Jung's language, is to peel away everything you learn to be so you can become who you actually are. And that process always leads through the shadow. The shadow is where your unspoken resentment hides, where your real needs wait in silence, where all the parts you denied gather in darkness. The empath's turning point comes when they finally look at the shadow, not with fear, but with curiosity. I once knew a man named Rowan who was admired by everyone at work for being so patient and so understanding. When his team fell behind, he stayed late. When his manager panicked, he soothed them. When a colleague messed up, he took the blame. They praised his reliability, but not once did anyone ask how he was holding up. One afternoon, Rowan was asked to fix a project someone else had ignored for months. He hesitated, for the first time, and the room changed. His manager's smile dropped. A teammate rolled his eyes. Someone muttered, "He's being difficult today." That was the moment the persona cracked. The persona, the mask Rowan wore to be accepted, had trained everyone to expect perfection. But the shadow had finally stepped forward, asking for fairness. The dramatic irony is this. Rowan thought people appreciated him. In reality, they appreciated the mask. And the moment he stopped performing, the truth surfaced. He wasn't valued, he was used, and the person who allowed it was himself. This is the hidden danger of an empath's generosity. When you give without limit, people take without thought. You teach them not to see you. That is why Jung insisted that real transformation begins when a person meets the parts they abandoned. Individuation doesn't make you someone new. It makes you someone whole. So the question becomes, what happens when the empath finally stops apologizing for existing? What happens when they let their shadow speak? Something powerful. The next time someone calls you so understanding, you will pause and ask yourself, do they know your pain too? The next time you feel drained after helping, you will wonder, Was I giving from love or from fear of being unloved? This is the shift, the breaking, the awakening. The empath stops performing the rescuer, and the world around them reshapes itself, often uncomfortably, often revealingly. But the reward is profound: clarity, truth, and the first breath of selfhood. And once the empath sheds the mask of the rescuer, they stop attracting people who only come to be rescued and start meeting those who come to truly see them. It always begins with a small betrayal, one so quiet, so subtle, that even the empath doesn't notice it happening. A silent moment where they tell themselves, "It's fine, let it go," even though their chest tightens and their voice falls quiet. This is the moment that repeats hundreds of times across years, forming a pattern they never meant to create. People assume betrayal is loud, slammed doors, harsh arguments, dramatic exits. But for empaths, the real betrayal is internal. It's the slow surrendering of their truth in exchange for temporary peace. Carl Jung warned us about this when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because accepting oneself means showing parts of you that others may not like, and that is the fear most empaths carry from childhood. Many empaths learn early that being agreeable keeps them safe. They read the room before they enter it. They adjust their tone, their needs, even their personality, depending on who stands in front of them. This is the persona, the outer mask, built for survival. Jung described it as the compromise between the individual and society. For the empath, the persona becomes a shield, the helper, the listener, the forgiver, the one who never asks for too much, even when their soul aches for reciprocity. They don't choose this role. They grow into it, slowly, out of necessity. But every time they swallow their truth to keep someone comfortable, a small part of them disappears into the shadow, the hidden box where all unmet needs and unspoken emotions are stored. And the shadow does not stay silent forever. Take Amanda, for example, a woman who spent 10 years in a marriage where she was everything her husband needed. She became his calm when he was angry, his therapist when he was lost, and his forgiveness when he failed her over and over. She believed that love meant adapting. She believed harmony meant silence. But the deeper truth was more tragic. He never truly met her because she never truly appeared. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Amanda avoided facing her own soul by believing that being endlessly available would make her indispensable. But one morning, without warning, her husband left. Not because she failed him, but because the version of her he saw wasn't real. He loved the mask, not the woman. And when she finally asked why, he said something that shattered everything. "You were always there. I thought you always would be." That is the twisted irony of the empath's journey. The persona they wear to stay loved becomes the very reason they are taken for granted. The more they disappear into caring for others, the more invisible they become. People rely on them, but they do not see them. They appreciate the comfort, but not the cost. And slowly, the empath becomes a ghost inside their own life. Eventually, the shadow pushes back. It whispers, at first, a quiet ache in the soul, a sense that something is wrong. But if ignored long enough, it becomes a rupture. A moment where the empath finally realizes they haven't just been betrayed by others, they've been betraying themselves. And that revelation hurts more than abandonment ever could. Comment if you've ever noticed this in someone you know, the kind of person everyone relies on, but no one really sees. That's when the empath realizes. When you disappear for others, you teach them how to live without you. It always starts with a silence so subtle, you don't even notice it at first. A slower reply, a colder tone, a slight shift in the air, and yet something inside you senses it, that familiar ache that whispers, something is changing. Most empaths don't realize that the moment they stop over-functioning for others, the relationship begins to loosen on the other side. Not because of conflict, but because the silent expectations that held it together start to crack. Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And that is exactly what happens here. People fade because the empath's hesitation forces them to face themselves. Imagine a man named Caleb. He was the dependable co-worker, the kind who stayed late to fix someone else's project, covered shifts without being asked, and absorbed the emotional storms of the entire team. His persona, the mask Jung describes, was the strong one, the emotional sponge who never complained. But one week, Caleb hit a wall. A family emergency shook him, and for the first time, he didn't jump to help others. When his co-worker Jason came to rant about his marriage troubles, Caleb said softly, "I can't talk right now. I'm dealing with something." Jason froze. He wasn't angry. He was confused because without realizing it, he had never actually built a connection with Caleb, only with Caleb's role. This is what Jung called a projection collapse. Jason wasn't relating to Caleb the man. He was relating to the image he needed Caleb to be. In psychological terms, Jason projected the archetype of the rescuer onto him. And when Caleb stepped out of that archetype, Jason had no idea who Caleb actually was. So instead of adapting, he simply withdrew. He started talking to others. He stopped checking in. And Caleb, confused and hurt, wondered if he had done something wrong. This is the painful irony. The empath spends years nurturing others, building connections they believe are mutual. But the other person was often connecting only to the function, not the human. It creates a slow, quiet unraveling, the kind no one talks about. People don't announce their departure from an empath's life. They slip away, almost weightless, like mist dissolving in morning light. And the empath, trained to doubt themselves, thinks, "Maybe I cared too much. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I should have tried harder." But the truth is much darker and simpler. The emotional contract was always unspoken, but binding. You fix me, you absorb me, you disappear for me, and I will stay, as long as you never stop. When the empath hesitates, even for a moment, the role collapses, and so does the bond. There is no dramatic fight, no confrontation, no explanation. Just a quiet exit that leaves the empath questioning their own worth. Jung would say the relationship was never real. It was two shadows and dancing, never two souls meeting. And this is why the ending feels so hollow. Because you cannot mourn a betrayal that never happened. You can only mourn the realization that the connection you believed in was never truly mutual. And deep down, something else begins to form, a new awareness, painful but powerful, that will lead to the next stage of awakening. And that's when you realize they didn't leave you. They left the role you stopped performing. You'll notice it always begins with a question that hits like a punch to the chest. How could they move on so quickly? It's a simple question, but it carries a storm underneath it, a storm Jung understood better than anyone. Because behind that question lies a deeper fear that most empaths never say out loud. Did they ever care at all? This moment is not just heartbreak. It's a collision with the repressed self, the part of you that has been waiting in the shadows, demanding to be loved not for what it gives, but for what it is. Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but grows." And this is where that truth reveals its teeth. All the feelings the empath buried for years, the anger, the exhaustion, the unmet needs, rise to the surface like ghosts finally reclaiming a voice. This shift doesn't come softly. It arrives with rage that scares you, with grief that feels too heavy for your chest, with the terrifying realization that many of the relationships you poured your soul into were never truly mutual. You weren't just carrying emotions, You were carrying the entire illusion of connection, and the tragic irony is that you didn't even know it. You believed you were building bonds, but you were building lifelines for people who had nothing to give back. I once knew a man named Elijah. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't loud. He was the quiet center of his family, the one everyone leaned on when chaos erupted. He remembered birthdays no one else remembered. He made the calls no one else wanted to make. He solved problems no one else could handle. In Jungian terms, he lived entirely inside the archetype of the caretaker, the emotional anchor, the steady hand. But like all archetypes, it carried a shadow. And Elijah never saw his own shadow until it was too late. When his father passed away, Elijah became the strong one. He arranged everything, calmed distant relatives, handled the paperwork, kept everyone together. People praised him for being so strong, never realizing they were praising him for abandoning his own grief. But the real breaking point came months later. The funeral was over. The visits stopped. The phone calls faded. And no one, not one person, thought to ask him how he was doing. Not even once. Elijah told me something I never forgot. He said, "It's like I disappeared the moment I stopped being useful." And he was right, but not in the way he thought. The persona he had lived behind for years, the helpful one, the strong one, the calm one, had finally cracked, and what was revealed wasn't weakness, but truth. For the first time, people were no longer relating to the mask. They were seeing the man beneath it, lost, grieving, human. Jung believed the persona is a necessary mask, but warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Elijah had never been allowed to be anything but needed, and now that he wasn't needed, he was invisible. But here's the twist most empaths never see coming. That invisibility is not the wound, it's the doorway. Because in that loneliness, Elijah finally met the forgotten parts of himself, the parts he had hidden to keep everyone else whole. His grief, his anger, his desire to be loved without performing. And that meeting, painful as it was, became the beginning of his healing. This is where the empath awakens. Not in the moment they are abandoned, but in the moment they understand why. Because when the world no longer needs you, you finally discover who sees you. And in that discovery, the next revelation slowly begins to rise. Because when no one needs you, you finally learn whether anyone truly loves you. It always begins with a quiet shock, that moment when the empath finally steps back, only to see the world around them shift in ways they never expected. People don't clap. They don't thank you for finally honoring your limits. Instead, something much darker happens. The room grows cold. Faces tighten. The same people who praised your kindness now question your character. And in that instant, you realize a truth so sharp it feels like a blade. They were never afraid of losing you. They were afraid of losing their access to you. Carl Jung warned us, the persona is what one is in reality not, but what oneself and others think one is. And for most empaths, that persona is the gentle, endlessly forgiving giver, the one who absorbs everyone's storms, the one who never falls apart. But here's the twist. The empath believes they're holding everyone together, when in reality, they're the one most terrified of collapsing. They fear the moment the mask slips, the moment someone sees their exhaustion, their confusion, their buried anger. That fear forces them to keep performing long after their soul is tired. Yet the more they cling to this persona, the further they drift from their true self. Jung called this disconnection a psychic mutilation, because when you cut off your real emotions to keep the peace, you cut off the parts of you that make you whole. Consider Daniel, a calm and collected operations manager who seemed unshakable. Everyone came to him with problems, deadlines, conflicts, breakups. He solved everything with a soft tone and a patient smile. But behind closed doors, Daniel barely slept. He kept his real emotions locked away, believing that showing weakness would make him less dependable. The persona became a cage, one he built, polished, and guarded. And then came the breaking point. One morning, after years of quietly carrying the emotional weight of his team, Daniel told his colleagues he couldn't take on extra work anymore. He needed help. He needed rest. The reaction was instant and brutal. His manager accused him of changing. A co-worker whispered, "He's not the same person anymore." Others became distant, irritated, even resentful. Daniel felt as if he had betrayed the role they depended on. But the truth was far more unsettling. The moment he became real, people lost interest. This is what Jung meant by projection collapse. They weren't relating to Daniel, only to the version of him they benefited from. They admired the mask, not the man, and when the mask cracked, their attachment shattered with it. The irony is almost cruel. The empath fears that if they ever stop rescuing, they'll be abandoned. And yet the abandonment happens anyway, not because they failed, but because they finally showed their truth. People who were comfortable with their silence, their sacrifice, their endless yes, suddenly feel threatened by their authenticity. They say things like, "You're being selfish. You've changed. You're not the same." But beneath those words lies a confession they'll never say out loud. "You're no longer easy for me to control." My friend Jonah once described it perfectly. He said, "The moment I stopped apologizing for my feelings, half my relationships died overnight." And he didn't say it with bitterness. He said it with clarity. Because he finally understood that those relationships had never been rooted in mutual respect, only in his willingness to shrink. So if you're an empath waking up, finally noticing the masks you've worn, the roles you've played, the parts of yourself you buried just to be loved, you must understand the truth unfolding before you. The loneliness you feel now is not a punishment. It is the first taste of real freedom. A freedom that demands you stand in your full identity, not in the version of yourself others prefer. Because the ones who leave when you set boundaries were only there because you didn't. It's always the silence that scares people the most. Not the arguments, not the abandonment, the silence that enters your life the moment you stop being who everyone needed you to be. At first, it feels like a cold wind hitting an open wound. You've stepped away from overgiving, from absorbing everyone's emotions, from apologizing for things you never caused, and suddenly the world around you goes quiet. The calls fade. The invitations stop. The warmth that once felt constant now feels like a distant memory. But here's the hidden truth, that silence isn't punishment, it's revelation. Carl Jung said, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." And when an empath begins to honor that unknown self, the world around them changes. This silence is actually a psychological mirror. It reflects who stayed connected only to your persona, the mask you wore to be accepted. According to Jung, the persona protects us but also traps us, because people fall in love with the mask, not the soul beneath it. When you stop performing that mask, some people vanish, and that disappearance is the first sign of truth. Suddenly, you begin to see how many relationships depended not on mutual care, but on your self-abandonment. Take the story of Adrian, a man known in his friend group as the peacekeeper. He solved every conflict, remembered every birthday, and listened to every emotional breakdown. But when he started therapy and learned to set boundaries, the shift was immediate. One friend accused him of being cold. Another joked he was changing for the worse. But the most painful moment came from his closest friend, Leo. When Adrian finally said no to helping him with a crisis that wasn't his responsibility, Leo didn't argue. He simply disappeared. Days passed, then weeks. For years, Adrian thought their bond was a brotherhood. But in that silence, he saw the truth. Leo had never been bonded to him, only to the emotional labor he provided. And the cruelest irony, Leo was the one who always claimed Adrian was family. This is the turning point Jung warned about, when the unconscious parts of yourself begin to rise, forcing you to confront what you once explained away. Relationships built on your invisibility cannot survive your awakening. And as painful as it feels, that collapse is a form of individuation, the process of becoming your true self. The silence is not empty, it is the clearing of space. It is the removal of noise so you can finally hear your own inner voice. But here's where the mystery deepens. Once the old, draining connections fall away, new people begin to appear quietly, naturally, almost as if they were waiting behind a doorway you couldn't see before. People who ask how you are without needing something. People who don't shrink when you say no. People who don't disappear when you stop performing. This shift is subtle but powerful, and almost no empath sees it coming. They expect loneliness. Instead, they discover truth. And truth comes with a question, one many are afraid to answer. Who remains when your usefulness is gone? Because in that quiet space you realize you weren't losing everyone, you are finally seeing who was never truly there. There's a moment in every empath's life when the world expects them to break, but instead they transform. It doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't come with a dramatic fight or a grand speech. It begins the moment the empath realizes that their pain isn't a burden, it's raw material. And this is where the story takes its greatest twist. Jung believed that the true journey of inner growth wasn't about avoiding suffering, but integrating it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. And for the wounded empath, this darkness becomes the forge where their new self is created. Most people never see this shift coming. They think the empath is fragile because they cry more, feel more, notice more. But what they don't realize, what the empath doesn't realize at first, is that sensitivity is not weakness. It's sensitivity without boundaries that becomes weakness. Once the empath stares directly into the shadow they've avoided for years, something powerful begins to rise. Their anger, once swallowed to keep the peace, starts turning into insight. Their grief, once hidden to protect others, becomes a compass. Their heartbreak stops being a wound and becomes a doorway. Take the story of Elias, a man everyone at work called the Calm One. During meetings, he soothed tensions. When deadlines slipped, he was the first to step in. People admired him, but no one ever wondered why he never spoke about himself. Then one evening, after a brutal week of cleaning up others' mistakes, Elias found himself sitting in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't angry at anyone, he was angry at himself. Angry for giving so much of his life away in little pieces. That night, something changed. He decided he would no longer fix problems he didn't create. And the next day, the world that once adored him began to shift. His co-workers looked confused when he didn't jump in to solve everything. His manager grew tense when he calmly said, "No, that's not my responsibility." But here's the mystery others could not understand. Elias wasn't becoming colder. He was becoming clearer. He wasn't withdrawing. He was returning to himself. The rage he once folded into silence now helped him recognize who truly respected him and who only relied on him. That is the alchemy Jung spoke of, the moment the empath stops absorbing pain and begins transforming it. The persona cracks. The shadow emerges. And instead of hiding it, the empath finally integrates it. They become more solid, less easily manipulated, less afraid of disappointment. And ironically, the very people who once depended on their weakness now struggle to face their strength. But the deepest irony is this: the world doesn't fall apart when the empath stops fixing it. People adapt, they grow, they take responsibility. And the empath learns something shocking, something they were never taught. They never had to disappear to belong. They never had to shrink to be safe. They never had to sacrifice themselves to be loved. Because the moment you own your full self, You stop attracting people who need you, half alive. It often begins with a quiet realization that feels almost like a warning from somewhere deep inside you. A whisper telling you that the way you have been loving others is not the way you are meant to love yourself. Most people mistake this moment for bitterness or detachment, but Jung would call it something far greater: the beginning of integration. He said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration." And this is the line that becomes the turning point for every empath who has spent years giving away pieces of themselves just to feel accepted. Because when you hear those words at the right moment, they strike like lightning. It becomes clear that the goal was never to stop being kind. It was to stop being erased. This shift does not happen in a heroic flash. It usually unfolds in small but powerful moments, like when Michael, a soft-spoken project manager, realized he always stayed late to solve everyone else's problems. Yet no one ever stayed for him. He wasn't angry at his team. He was angry at himself for teaching them that his needs were optional. One night, after quietly fixing yet another crisis for a colleague, Michael walked outside into the cold air and felt something unfamiliar: the shadow stirring. Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves we push down, the parts we are afraid to show: anger, disappointment, desire, expectations. For empaths, the shadow often contains their boundaries, their voice, their right to be seen. And when Michael finally let himself feel the resentment he had buried for years, it didn't destroy him, it revealed him. But the real mystery is what happens next. Once an empath meets their shadow, the dynamic of their relationships begins to change, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Take the example of David, a calm, patient friend who everyone admired. Whenever his friend Aaron spiraled into emotional chaos, David rushed in, offering advice, comfort, endless support. He thought this made him a good friend. But one evening, during another late-night call filled with drama, something shifted. David noticed a pattern. Aaron only called when he needed rescuing. He never asked how David was doing, never listened, never stayed once his crisis was over. That night, when David finally said, "I can't talk right now, I need rest," Aaron fell silent, confused. It was the first crack in the persona David had worn for years. Jung warned, the persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society. And when an empath challenges that persona, people around them often don't know how to react. There is dramatic irony in these moments, because while the empath thinks they are simply setting a boundary, others feel as if the entire relationship has changed. And the truth is, it has. When you integrate your shadow, you stop offering emotional labor as currency. You stop participating in one-sided bonds. You stop letting others feed from your silence. The empath becomes gentle, but no longer compliant, giving, but no longer depleted, compassionate, but no longer willing to disappear for someone else's comfort. And this unsettles people who only admired the mask. But something beautiful, almost poetic, begins to happen as well. The empath no longer feels pulled toward people who are constantly breaking, constantly needing, constantly draining. Instead, they start noticing people who show up with stability, reciprocity, presence, people who listen, people who can hold space instead of consuming it. And this shift reveals something even deeper. The empath was never addicted to broken people. They were avoiding their own healing by trying to heal others. Once that truth rises from the unconscious, everything changes. When the empath integrates the shadow, their presence becomes less about being needed and more about being real. They stop rescuing and start relating. And in that space, love becomes mutual, not because they finally earned it, but because they finally believed they deserved it. It always begins with a quiet, almost unbearable realization, the kind that doesn't explode, but sinks slowly into the heart like a final truth you can no longer outrun. The empath discovers, often too late, that the real abandonment was never done to them. It was something they did to themselves, piece by piece, year after year, and this revelation arrives not as anger, but as a haunting clarity. The people they loved did not fail them as much as they failed to show themselves. They hid their needs behind politeness, masked their exhaustion behind kindness, and swallowed their fears behind a lifetime of saying yes. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this terror becomes a way of life. They avoid being seen, believing invisibility will keep them safe. What they don't know yet is that invisibility is exactly what destroys them. Consider Daniel, a loyal friend who never asked for support. He comforted others after breakups, celebrated their victories, showed up at midnight when someone was hurting, but never once admitted his own loneliness. His persona was the strong one, the reliable one, the man who never faltered. But personas are masks, and Jung warned that the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. One night, when Daniel finally confessed he was struggling, his friends didn't know how to respond. Not because they didn't care, but because he had trained them never to see him. The irony was cruel. He feared rejection so deeply that he hid his true self, and by hiding it, he created the very disconnection he feared. His whole world had been built on a role he played too well. This is the silent tragedy of the empath. They think they are being selfless, when in reality they are slowly disappearing. They confuse giving with bonding. They confuse patience with love. They confuse sacrifice with connection, but sacrifice without expression becomes emptiness. Over time, the empath's shadow grows heavier, all the unspoken resentment, all the ignored needs, all the suppressed anger, until it erupts not in rage, but in numbness. That numbness is the final warning sign, the place where the empath realizes they have spent years building a life that requires them not to exist. The people around them were never malicious. They simply adapted to the version of the empath that was easiest to absorb. There is dramatic irony here. The empath believed that loving harder would create deeper relationships, while the universe kept trying to reveal the opposite truth. Depth requires visibility, not performance. And when the mask finally cracks, the empath stands in the ruins of relationships that never truly saw them. But in that devastation, something remarkable begins. They start to notice the patterns they once refused to name. They begin to question the stories they told themselves about worth and love. They begin to confront the shadow they buried under kindness. And for the first time, they do not run. This is where the journey shifts. Not backward, not toward the old self, but forward, toward the person they were meant to become before fear taught them to hide. The fixer, the rescuer, the emotional crutch. These were roles, not identities. And when they fall away, what remains is the authentic self, fragile but real. Jung taught that the important question is not who likes you, but who sees you. Because being liked is about performance, but being seen is about truth. And truth is the beginning of wholeness. So if you've felt this in your bones, if you've lived inside a persona built on silence, if you've loved from fear instead of fullness, then understand this. Your awakening is not a collapse. It is a rebirth. It is the moment you finally refuse to vanish inside your own life. Because the day the empath sees their pain was not proof of weakness, but a map to their true self, is the day their real life begins.